That's good news. Hopefully we'll have everyone joining in a second. Welcome, everyone. We're going to do the usual wait for a couple of minutes. I think I see 14 or 15 of you here so far. We're expecting a few more, so give it a couple of minutes. Hopefully you come to the right room. We've got the slides up on the screen for you, so hopefully you've come to the right place where we'll be talking about the Transition Lab as a framework for financing change in the Fens. So if you are in the wrong room, feel free to drop out or stay for curiosity's sake. Peace out. Super. Okay. I think we should get started. I imagine a few other people are going to drop in over the next few minutes, and happy half term for any of those people that are joining and enjoying some downtime through half term. Yes, today we're going to be talking about the Transition Lab as a framework for financing change in the Fens. My name's Gemma. I work for North Star Transition. As is the conversation with everyone at the moment, particularly worried about the heat, and being a farming girl, especially worried about its impact on farming. And that's highly relevant for the Fens, which we'll be talking about today as well. And I'm joined today by two of the other team members on the programme team, and that's Phil from Jacobs and Vicky, who also works at North Star. And I think firstly, just wanted to start with saying it's a little unusual for us to be doing a webinar format. Talking at an audience is somewhat conflicting to our Transition Lab approach and methodology. And that's something I'll be covering today. Like, what do we mean by the Transition Lab approach? So you'll get why I say that when I describe it. But we thought this a really unique opportunity to give a sneak peek into the systems change work and financing work and breaking down silos we're doing with Anglian Water and over 250 stakeholders in the Fens, with the vision to build a regenerative and resilient Fens. And when I say we, it's a small and mighty team. It's across North Star Transition, who I work for, as I said, UCL's Climate Action Unit, Jacobs, from which you'll hear from Phil today, as well as Mott MacDonald. And we're doing the work for Anglian Water, and as you see on screen, a resilient Fens region. And I talked about the temperature at the beginning. I think the weekend holiday temperatures and fear of summer drought really anchor what we're going to be talking about today in reality. But to get us started, I'm doing a lot of talking already. I really want to take a moment for you all just to share your name in the chat and a curiosity or a quick point as to what drew you here today. It doesn't have to be lengthy, just something to give us a little bit of a flavour of what sparked your interest. It might help shape our discussion later at the end after we've presented, or perhaps some questions you may want to ask throughout. So if you can all do that, that would be amazing. Please give you a minute or so. And please let us know if you can't access the chat function or other, and we can sort out any technical difficulties. Don't be scared, everyone. Few other people joining as well, so welcome to those of you who've just joined. Just a few people writing in the chats their name and an interesting point of like why they've come today, what sparked their interest or curiosity, just to help us potentially shape how we're going to talk to you or answer questions and open up the discussion later in the session. Hello, Sasha, Rebalance, Melvin, UKIA, Okay. If you add just anything you're interested in hearing about, or why you've joined, that would be amazing to gather those insights as well, please. Reservoirs, rightly so.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too.
Thanks for meeting. It's lovely to hear
Thank
you.
you so much. Thank you for this very useful network, and also very useful listen for me. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you too.
Thank you. If anyone else wants to unmute for a couple of minutes, we're happy for that too. I've got various people. Fiona, interested in alternative financing. You've come to the right place. Daisy Copping, financing as well. Vicky, you've got lots of questions coming your way later in the session. Mina, people and communication side, not only technical. Saloni, lead local flood authority in Peterborough. Amazing, a good range of people. Melvin from the UKIA. Super. Okay. Well, keep typing. We're not just going to ignore you typing away. Everything's going to be logged, and we'll hope to come back to specific questions in time, not just at the end. If you want to unmute and ask questions throughout, please do stop us. So we did a bit of thinking in setting up and designing the time that we've got here today. What we hoped we could help you walk away with today. Maybe one or all of these, who knows? The first is really around just curiosity about the Transition Lab approach to systems change and how it's underpinned by psychology and neuroscience, and really how it can break down siloed working. The second is to understand how specific interventions, of which there are many, but today we'll focus in on one from Phil, like a water market, and how that could support system change in the Fens. And the third is really to walk away with a different perspective on finance, one that is aligned with systems thinking, and Vicky will be talking to that. So without further ado, let me start with where we're working, the Fens. And I imagine, given the nature of all of you and the roles which you have, many of you I see are working in the Fens, is a landscape many of you know well, but for those who don't, it's one that sits right at the heart of why, I guess, integrated and cross-sector approaches matter. The Fens, it was drained in the 17th century and transformed into a highly productive agricultural region in the UK, supplying a fifth of the country's crops, a third of the vegetables, so we all don't go hungry. But it's under pressure. Much of it's below sea level. It's held in place by pumps which run continuously, and we're talking about the heat we've just experienced. We're feeling the effects of climate change a lot in the Fens. And a view into some of the specific tensions. Think farmers who are depending on spray irrigation, with climate change making summers drier, winters wetter. So the water does exist, but it's at the wrong time of year for farmers. So they need the capacity to capture winter runoff for their summer use. Meanwhile, you have communities growing across the region, and fast. So a water company needs to secure the drinking water for the expanding population while also meeting environmental needs. And then you might have the Environment Agency, who are managing flood risk in the region, which is on the rise with climate change. And it's worsened by over 25% of flood management infrastructure coming to the end of its life. And that's all underpinned by the drainage system itself, where the Fens is only existing because of the continuous pump drainage managed by the internal drainage boards. But those pressures are all inseparable. They all interact constantly. And that interdependence is really why we're here and why no single actor can solve the challenge alone. And I think really important to highlight in the Fens is that we aren't starting from scratch. There's a region with many stakeholders, years of research, and a huge desire for action and scale. Deep diving into the problems and the challenges is no longer an answer. The challenges are clear. It's really moving towards that action forwards. And that's exactly why there are initiatives like Fens 2100, which is led by the EA, as well as Future Fens Integrated Adaptation, or FFIA for short, which is led by Anglian Water. And that's what they exist to do, bring stakeholders together across the Fens to work towards a regenerative, a resilient Fens region. And that's the part where our work within the Transition Lab and the partners I mentioned earlier are seeking to support. So next slide. What is a Transition Lab? I'm talking this terminology. What do we actually mean by it? And how are we actually integrating that into the FFIA? So at large, it's a systems change approach that's grounded in neuroscience and psychology. And that's really about bringing together diverse stakeholders across sectors, across organizations to build relationships, to find a shared direction, and to co-design solutions together. And I'm a visual person, so please bear with me if you're not a visual person, and hopefully this lands if you are a visual person. But I like to think of the Transition Lab and what we're trying to do as a raft across a turbulent river. So think of yourself standing on the bank of a turbulent river, perhaps a little bit different to the photo you see in the image here. I couldn't find a picture we'd had in the Fens of a turbulent river yet, so this one had to stick for now. But think of it as turbulent. And you're standing with the organisations, the sectors that I mentioned earlier, the farmer who needs water, the flood risk engineer who needs it moved away, Anglian Water balancing growing community demands, or the drainage board managing an ageing system. And on the other side of that river, you see a different landscape, one that's more resilient, more regenerative, the one you really want for yourselves in this system. But the current in the river is strong. There's complexity, there's disconnection, there's inertia. And to make that real, that's meaning different funding streams, different statutory duties, different institutional cultures. So it feels impossible to swim across alone. And it's only through, therefore, collaborating, this is the word that everyone talks about, but it is core to the Transition Lab, that we can build a shared and resilient raft, and that collective desire to propel and to actually steer it in the right way, that we can actually make that crossing together. And the Transition Lab itself is essentially that raft, as well as the propulsion, how it gets across, and the wayfinding, the steering. So hopefully that lands a little to those who, have a visual mindset like me. But I'm going to move to the next slide just to deep dive into the neuroscience bit. And this is where UCL's Climate Action Unit methodology comes into play. And I promise it's more intuitive, I think, than it sounds. But it's built on a simple insight that there's lasting simple systems change that requires three things to shift and reinforce one another in a system. And that's the actions, relationships, and mental models that you see down the left-hand side. So within actions, what do we mean? We mean what people actually do, the policies, the practices in play. With relationships, we mean the quality of trust between people across sectors, across organizations, and across cultures. And by mental models, we mean what's in here, the beliefs, the assumptions that shape what we as people think is even possible. So often, interventions in complex systems that we're working in go straight to actions because there's just a deep desire to do something. But if the relationships aren't there, and if people don't believe that change is possible, perhaps because it's too complex or too entrenched or too big, then actions may not even stick, or even worse, start. So in the Fens, we see both problems in that stakeholders, perhaps across food, water, nature, transport, don't often sit in the same room. And when they do, they may not trust each other. That is changing. And it's not a criticism, it's just where we've started in the Transition Lab, knowing that there's no magic silver bullet, and fostering that connection and collaboration across different sectors and organizations is vital. But how do we do that then? And I am going to come back to the raft analogy because I think it helps here. But we see the leverage point as bringing together disconnected allies, essentially people, together around a shared vision. And it's that shared vision that builds the belief. And as the belief grows, bolder action becomes possible that can then move towards that shared, resilient, and regenerative Fens that people want. So think back to the raft here. when I say bringing disconnected allies, I mean the farmers, the EA, the communities, the transport system, the health system. They come together on that river shore to align around a vision, aka we need to build a raft to cross here. So they come together around that vision, which enables them to take the first action, being, okay, we're going to grab our first 2 pieces of wood and join them together. And that's what we call like the leverage point or crowbar opportunity, which is a specific action which can then unlock further change in a complex system and drive the belief in those people that change is actually possible. And as belief grows, other actions, think back to the raft, okay, we're going to test now if this raft we've put together holds our weight. And then, okay, can we all fit on it together? So the partnerships in the environment can actually scale. So yeah, hopefully that helps somewhat break down kind of the methodology, the neuroscience behind what we're doing. But to move away from the analogy and make it specific to the Fens challenges I mentioned earlier, for example, with water management and irrigation, a particular action, for example, could be around getting farmers together in a farm cluster group, ones that perhaps are currently working in their isolated farms, to develop not only one specific farm reservoir on their farm holding, but a system of interconnected farm reservoirs which are nature-based by design and which store winter flows and can share water, for example, for their crop needs in the summer, which I'll come to next. But just to think about, finalize on this methodology and the Transition Lab at large, is to have 2 takeaways really. And that's one, that change is non-linear. So where we're talking actions, relationships, mental models, all 3 of those conditions need to shift together and reinforce one another. It's not just as simple as one, the other, full stop. And the second is that the Transition Lab isn't the finished product. It's something we've been working on for regional systems change at North Star Transition, and we have other transition labs in the Waiusk in Wales and Fife. But it's an approach we're testing, learning, and refining as we go. So hopefully I didn't lose any of you there. Hopefully the raft across the river worked. Would love to hear your thoughts if it was far away from helping make sense of things. Please feel free to pop your thoughts in the chat. I always welcome them. But just wanted to finalise here before handing over to Phil on a specific intervention that's come up that you could all be really curious about, was how we've actually applied the Transition Lab approach and methodology to the Fens with Anglian Water. And over the past 8 months, we've built on phase 1 work, which was really around that shared vision, the raft, which you see here. But the takeaway is that the vision is holistic. It requires a holistic cross-sector collaborative approach with some examples. I don't know whether you can actually see super well, but there's a variety from clean, affordable transport opportunities to sustained productivity to meet food needs, or enhanced health and well-being of the local communities, the integrated efficient water management system, as well as enhanced biodiversity. No single sector can work towards that vision. And so through the approach, we've worked with over 250 stakeholders who've shared their breadth of ideas with us to generate what we've got as a long list of potential interventions across the Fens, which we've split into 5 themes. I'm not going to go into detail there, but they cross sort of agriculture, mid-level infrastructure, land use, economic networks, for example, and which really help work towards the vision the stakeholders have together. And through our part is through the systems analysis and mapping interlinkages between interventions and really understanding where there's stakeholder appetite and energy. We've prioritized an initial shortlist of 12 for their potential to be those crowbar opportunities or systems levers I mentioned earlier that can unlock broader change. And to give you a flavour, what are we talking about here? What are some of these interventions? There's the example I mentioned earlier of developing on-farm reservoirs. Melvin, I know you're in the audience today. Also scaling the reach and impact of farm cluster groups, which yes, could link to the farm reservoirs, but also broader knowledge exchange or nature-based interventions on farm, as well as developing a water market that enables water trading, which Phil is nicely going to talk about in a moment. I think just to say here, we would love to share more with all of you on all of these interventions, but given the time, we could only focus on one today. But if there's curiosity, questions about any of the others, please feel free to ask either now or in the chat, and we can address them shortly. So over to you, Phil.
Over to me. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Gemma. So my name is Phil Rayner. I work for Jacobs, and I'm a fellow of SciWEM and Chartered Water Environmental Manager. So pleased to be talking to you today about water markets. So I'm leading one of the themes that Gemma just mentioned. That theme is around landscape transformation and ideally at scale. So we did an initial exercise, some workshops trying to identify potentially interventions, looking for those crowbar measures which might lead to some transformation at scale. And we really felt that one of the comments, many of them you can see on the screen for one of those workshop sessions, really resonated with the opportunity to influence land use across the board without being very place specific. And that comment and intervention was create a water market for non-potable water resources underpinned by on-farm reservoir storage. So you can see there as well, it links back to some of the other interventions that were identified and that we're currently working on. So farm clusters, on-farm storage. So that's why we are looking at water markets, and I'm really excited about the potential that they hold. So we've been doing a bit of research. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Researching water markets elsewhere, why they work, why they don't, some of the challenges, etc. And I've got 4 examples on the screen just to talk through with you. A really local example is the Cambridge Water Credit Scheme. So the Cambridge Water Credit Scheme is a temporary one-off intervention that's designed to unlock housing and commercial development in and around Cambridge. It's a scheme that essentially allows new water demand from development to be offset by water savings created elsewhere within the catchment, across the source of water. And that saving creates a credit which then developers can use to demonstrate that they've complied with planning and environmental requirements, and that unlocks more water for other uses. It's essentially a water neutrality mechanism, and it encourages water efficiency. So it's not about increasing net total water available. Excuse me. If you move on to the next example, the Murray-Darling Basin across Australia, we could go back a slide, please. I'm just going to talk about these ones on this page first. The Murray-Darling Basin is probably the world's most mature and extensive water market. It's been operating for decades, and it really demonstrates that water markets can operate at scale. So it operates across several states across Australia. And in that system, you have water entitlements, which are separate legally from land. And those entitlements can be traded either permanently or temporarily within a season, within a basin-wide cap. So the evidence to today demonstrates that large volumes of water can be traded annually, especially during droughts. And it's driven a shift in how water is used and what the water is used for, from low-value crops, such as pasture and cereals, to more higher-value crops, higher-value uses. And governments across Australia have been able to purchase water through the market to restore environmental flows. So it's being used for both a shift in how water is used to get more value out of the water that's being used, but also to provide environmental flows. But it has impacted some communities. It's very complex, and that requires strong regulation and transparency and enforcement. If you move into the California water trading examples, there's lots of smaller, limited water trading schemes and banking schemes where there's seasonal transfers between irrigation districts. There's pilot groundwater trading schemes, and it's generally focused again on drought, environmental flows, and ensuring groundwater sustainability because it's a limited resource. It has provided flexibility. It has provided water for ecosystems. And I think crucially, as an example for us in the Fens, it provides a local fit. So the schemes are very much tailored to the specific basins that they're operating within. But in California, because there's lots of different examples running in parallel, governance can be fragmented and it can be quite slow. But it does demonstrate that small-scale, purpose-specific trading can work. Finally, Spanish examples of water banks have often been activated during drought emergencies when they really need to limit and control how much water is used. It's not, strictly speaking, a free market. It's controlled by basin authorities, and it's very much focused on drought relief to avoid broad-scale economic collapse where water is needed by certain industries, but they cannot get it in any other way. Volumes have been quite small, there's high transaction costs, and it's very complex. And another example in Chile was the creation of a fully tradable private water rights. And that provides a cautionary example where it has led to equity and ecosystem impacts because of hoarding and speculation. And so there's not always good outcomes from water markets. So we've been keen to learn the pros and cons of these other examples so that we can build them into our thinking for what a water market in the Fens might look like. We could just move on, please. So some key questions that we're keen to answer as we move forward with this intervention is there water to trade? Where is it? When is it available? And are there aspects around quality and the variability that we need to be cognizant of? Another key question is, who are the users and what are the uses? Is it farms? Is it nature for things like peat rewetting and other ecosystem services? Is it other businesses and other opportunities for things like housing and industry, which wasn't part of the original question. It was all focused upon non-potable uses, but why limit our exploration of this intervention to just non-potable sources? And who are the suppliers? Is it the farms? Is it farming clusters? Is it IDBs? Is it the water company, or a partnership or collection of all of them? So we also need to think about what elements are needed. So there's infrastructure for storage and transfer. There's physical infrastructure and also digital infrastructure linked to the monitoring of that water use and how it's moved around and shared. We also need to think around things like governance, prices, safeguards, rules, dispute resolution between those who want water and need it, and the availability of that water. And there's also considerable thought needed around current regulation and legislation and how to enable a water market to operate. And then we need to think about how it could work. Are we thinking about credits? Or are we thinking about the sale or transfer of water rights? Or are we thinking about the trading of physical water, the transfer of water into different places? And then finally, how is it going to be funded? Are we thinking about capital financing? Are we thinking about tariffs and usage fees, trading of rights, arbitrage perhaps, impact investment through things like ESG? And then how do we deal with things like productivity and margin gains? So there's lots of really complicated and complex things about every element of this, of a water market, that we really need to dive into. I can just move on to my final slide then. So as we move forward with this intervention, some of the key questions I have in my mind around how can we prioritize benefits? We really want a water market to help solve some of the challenges of water scarcity, environmental degradation and climate resilience that exist across the Fens, and perhaps to use it as a beacon to demonstrate how a water market could solve problems in similar places. We also need to be mindful of ensuring equity. The system must not be unfairly biased around the accrual of costs or benefits into certain parts of society. And we really need to, as a key part of our transition lab, identify the investable elements. The system must be both financially viable and scalable. And so investment needs to be channeled accordingly and returns found to encourage that investment. So I hope that sheds some light on one of our interventions, and I hope also that it can demonstrate how it can encourage and enable some system change. And I'll hand over to Vicky for the next stage.
Thanks very much, Phil. Yeah, I think a lot of you said that you might be interested in some of the financing elements, so I hope I can meet your expectations. I think what we've sort of come to the financing conversation with is a lot more questions than answers. So hopefully we can get to a place where we will have better questions in the future. So I think, we are just asking that question again at this slide: how can a regenerative and resilient Fens exist and be financed? And I think that the approach we take is a challenge for finance, so that it needs to respond to a system of needs rather than single projects. And I think, Phil's example of the water market is perfect. It's not just a single intervention that operates in isolation. It it could potentially feed into lots of different elements, and that's sort of expressed on the right-hand side of the slide with all of these different interests, potential interests into a single intervention, and all of them potentially having routes to finance around them, or routes towards getting revenue. So interventions needed for the Fens relate to a whole host of different sectors and expertise and benefits. And so, as Gemma was saying, that means that we typically work with multiple stakeholders to understand what the issues are and what they're trying to address. And very often, the big issues that stakeholders are concerned with in the Fens and elsewhere are connected to issues that other stakeholders face and have a stake in. So it's sort of a network of people who are all have a stake in this landscape in different ways. So as Gemma was talking about earlier, farming hinges on a reliable and safe water supply, and utilities work on reliable and safe water supply, but depend on the participation of different industries and of course agriculture as well. And they all rely on a reliable climate and environment. So the scale of the issue to be addressed is massive. Even for just a landscape like the Fens, the amount of, the scale of resources required to really transform that region and to really future-proof it and to adapt to the climate change issues that are, already with us is huge. And also the number of parties that need to be engaged in solving that problem is a very, very wide circle. And these two things are intrinsically connected. So that scale and the number of stakeholders the scale we need to change and the number of stakeholders that need to be involved are very tightly bound up. So, Macy, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So there are a lot of narratives that currently exist around where financing can and should come from. And there is a long-standing and pervasive idea that in a world where public budgets are increasingly limited, private finance can and should step in. And so on the slide, there's sort of a range of different types of private finance that have been sort of mentioned in lots of different contexts around this is actually, the avenue in which we could find finance for these things. So concessional loans, payments for ecosystem services, impact investment, philanthropy, all these things are being talked about a lot in this space. But private finance is not really a thing. It's a word used to describe a variety of non-state actors, as it's shown on the screen. There are lots of different types of private finance, and it's kind of used quite indiscriminately, that term. What people, sorry, excuse me. What people often mean by private finance is institutional finance, and these are sort of big institutions like banks, investment funds, pension funds, and they have multiple constraints to getting involved in the investments, mainly starting with the obligations to their clients and shareholders. And I'm sure a lot of you know that this already. I'm just sort of setting out our grounding of understanding as to where we're starting from in terms of finance. And as I mentioned previously, there are smaller sources of private capital, so philanthropy, impact investors. And in general, these types of capital have more flexibility with how they are used. And they can give grants or donations or concessional investments or with maybe an expectation of return or maybe not. But these are by their nature much smaller and much harder to scale. And as I was talking about earlier, the scale of the investment that's required in the Fens to really transform it and to make it adaptable to the changes that are happening is really quite large. So depending on impact investment or philanthropy for that whole arc is going to be very difficult. I also just want to quickly mention another two aspects of finance that often comes up in these kind of conversations, which is blended finance and aggregation. I'll start with blended finance first. And blended finance is kind of the idea that all of these different things can be brought together into one kind of investment package. And that the government can come in and help and take on a bit of a bigger risk to ensure that larger institutional investors can come in and do their work as well. That is definitely something that we are keen to explore, but, and this is an important but, it's very costly and complicated to put together a blended finance kind of approach, and it has never been done for a region. It's been done for infrastructure projects, it's been done in lots of specific like interventions, I would say, but not for a regional development. So there's a big question around, does that work? How could that work? Then the second approach, which I mentioned, which is about aggregating, and that's sort of looking at putting a lot of financing needs together to help bring on larger pools of capital. But this runs into kind of the similar kinds of project problems that blended finance runs into. So it's very costly to put together, and there are lots of governance issues. And it's complicated. So for such the scale of the problem really kind of hampers us going down that route. But again, we are looking into it and seeing how potential different sources of finance could be aggregated at a landscape scale and what that could potentially look like. Again, it hasn't been done before, to our knowledge. If anyone knows of somewhere where it's been done, please let us know. We'd love to hear about it. And just a small extra kind of point that we're also working through with a lot of this work, because it does pertain to lots of environmental pressures. Often people are very keen on payments for ecosystem services, and that's on the slide in the bottom left-hand corner. And essentially that's sort of monetizing environmental outcomes. And what we have found is that this is really quite different to the monetization of environmental outcomes is quite different to creating investable assets, which is what private finance is interested in. And a heavy focus on monetization can really distract from tackling root causes. Because if you're monetizing carbon sequestration, for example, you aren't actually tackling the root cause of why we need to sequester carbon in the first place. Or if you're monetizing biodiversity outcomes, again, like the root cause of that biodiversity loss is operating practices of companies and people, actors on the land. So you really aren't addressing those root problems if you start monetizing environmental outcomes. So we aren't yet convinced that this is a route towards really large scale systems change finance. And it's also very hard to convince mainstream investors to do something when businesses that have a mandate to implement these solutions don't do it in the first place. So a business that has a mandate to potentially increase biodiversity isn't doing it, but they expect to get money from payments for ecosystem services. It's not really a compelling business case for financial institutions. So these are kind of all the things we are grappling with, looking at what private finance means, looking at what blended finance could look like, looking at potentially aggregating things together, but also being really mindful of the fact that the current routes that are being opened up or being tried to open up around monetization of environmental outcomes leads to a lot of problems and potentially not the scale at which we need to be operating. So I will move on to avenues for exploration so that we can, there's some light at the end of the tunnel with the finance stuff, because I've just said a lot of things that are problematic about the way that people are approaching the finance question. So when we are thinking about ways to bring larger pools of money to solve these kind of problems, there are a few avenues that we think are fruitful. One is the recognition that sometimes the best solution is public money, when the public stakes are too high or when there is simply no commercial context for the project at hand. And it's really essential that we need to look at the role of public budget and regulation in reorienting existing spend. So what money flows are currently happening in the Fens, and how are they leading to the degenerative outcomes that we see for people living in the Fens, and how could that money that already exists be repurposed? And that should be done before we even start looking at new finance, because there's already a huge amount of money flowing into the Fens. It's a hugely economically productive region, and we should start by working with that and working to see how we can change how existing money flows before we're thinking about adding, bringing in more finance into the equation. So the second bullet point is we need to think about environmental and social questions in the context of how they manage or solve risk for business or for a project. And that actually means that it needs to be integrated in something much bigger than just simply looking at a single company's risk or a single project. Because if we're looking, for example, at flood risk in the Fens, that kind of affects everyone and at the same time is no one's responsibility. Well, the EA, but the EA doesn't have the funds to really address what needs to happen in the Fens at the moment. So that diffusion of responsibility needs to enable, we need to enable people to come together to bring that, to bring that responsibility together. And so to unlock finance in a pooled way for all of these people who have these risks. Then the third and final point is we are really keen to use familiar structures which investors recognize. So we want to make sure that the thing that is presented to commercial investors is something that is familiar to them, like a bond or an infrastructure project, things that they've been investing in for the last 70 years, and something that they've done many times before. And to keep it simple so that investors can like feel the familiarity of what they're seeing, and at the same time also stay innovative with how that money is being spent rather than what the structure is. So that is kind of where we're at with the our finance thinking. As I said at the beginning of my sort of section, we still have a lot of questions. We're probably raising more questions than answering, so I apologize for that. But what we always think it's important to remember is that finance is a tool and it's not a magic wand. The problems in the Fens are ones of collaboration, are ones of siloed thinking, are ones of lack of agency, and finance is a tool that can help unlock those things, but those problems still exist. So if we could just pop to the next slide. Yeah, so we like to end our North Star Transition kind of presentations or workshops with a little quote from Martin Luther King to say that we're just taking the next step and seeing where it leads. And as we do that, hopefully things will become clearer, but we don't necessarily know what our path is. And as Gemma was saying at the beginning, the transition labs are not linear processes. We are exploring, we're learning, we're trying to discover, we're trying to tease out possible routes forward. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Gemma for a bit of a wrap up.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Phil. And thank you, audience. Hopefully we kept some of your attention for that 40 minutes or so. I imagine it wasn't there for the whole time. I don't think in human terms we concentrate for more than, 7 minutes or something at a time? I think I might be even wrong there. But I would love to invite some questions. I know at the beginning I asked everyone kind of what drew you here today, and there was a lot of interest around the financing topic, particularly Fiona, you mentioned, for example, around financing around flood risk, Daisy around financing for climate change adaptation. So not just questions to you two, but if there are some questions, we'd love for people to unmute or just type in the chat anything that's kind of come to you today. Like, are you there thinking, what do you mean by a transition lab? Ask us and we can try and help. Or is it particularly around equitable outcomes in a water market that Phil was talking to when he was talking about those different examples, and something we're going to try to explore next? Or for Vicky's part, is it how can we think about funding that systems transition rather than isolated projects? Perhaps you're from a financing background, so still thinking on specific project-based finance, for example. Not to put the questions in your mouths, but just trying to reflect back on some of the curiosities you had at the beginning. Gonna stop talking, and hopefully there are a few questions that you can just unmute yourself for. We're a happy set of ears. Or maybe it's a basic question if there's not one, did the raft analogy help understand the transition lab concept? Again, with the approach, we're testing, learning how we explain and bring everybody along with that. So even if it's as simple as, did that work? please ask away.
Can I say something?
Please, Melvin.
Yeah. I'm a civil engineer by profession, and hence my interest in reservoirs. But I run the UK Irrigation Association, which has been just publicising reservoir issues, reservoir practical guidelines for farmers and what have you. I can get my head around what individuals are looking for, or even small groups are looking for. I find it difficult to get my head around the bigger picture where you're trying to sort of put it together. I'm all for the idea. I mean, I've heard Jyoti speak, and Brendan Bromwich at McDonald, who I know very well. But I think the audience for this, the stakeholders, if you like, want to call them, see, I think they're still a long way from this, and I'm sure you're aware of it. They're a long way out, and even getting farmers to work together on an Environment Agency local resource option is really challenging. I mean, I sat in the IDB office in the Fens at Prickwillow with about 20 farmers, and the idea was that they would begin to share their data and ways of going about things so you could bring them together in some sort of way. And immediately one guy dropped out. He said, well, I'm not going to share anything I've got here. I don't want the Environment Agency to start picking up that I might have a surplus. And the next thing I know, it's gone. So what it tells me is that the direction's fine, but I think we shouldn't expect too much earlier on, because just getting farmers to talk to each other, they're very independent people. Some recognize what's going on. Some have absolutely no idea what's going on water-wise. In fact, of the 20 farmers around the room, they were asked, how is your water, your water supply for your farm? And almost to a person, they said, I think we're okay, And I said, well, do you know what's coming down the line in terms of environmental destination? They said, what? What is that? And I ask this to groups as I go around, what is this environmental destination? What do you know about it? And I'm drawing big blanks everywhere I go. Whether we're bamboozling people with terminology and what have you. I mean, it took me a while to work out what people were talking about, and I'm still not sure, but I have an idea. But just getting people on the track is going to be a big challenge from that point of view. And I just wonder whether smaller projects that do and can be available are the building blocks to it, without sort of upsetting the fact that there might be bigger connections. So getting half a dozen farmers to think about sharing water and building a combined reservoir would be a big step forward in that direction. And particularly if you get the water companies in around Cambridge thinking about it, but they want potable water, not dirty farm water. It's I mean, they don't know how to clean water up, basically, do they, in Cambridge? It's all groundwater and it's clean. Farmers produce pretty mucky stuff, But anyway, that's another story. But just that fundamental building blocks, you've got to put the foundations in somewhere and slowly sort of infiltrate the ideas that actually this could influence this and influence that. And I'm sure we'll get there, but it's going to be quite a journey, I think. Sorry, I was a bit rambling there, but
no, it's really helpful. And I've got a few reflections, Melvin. I think the first is we fully agree, and what's aligned in our methodology is that point on smaller projects being building blocks. Back to kind of when I was explaining the theory of those, like bringing disconnected allies together, that's part one, to take those initial actions that might be the start, the seed of then the scale that then comes. So I think there's definitely no disregard to smaller projects, perhaps only 1 or 2 farm reservoirs being built to then demonstrate to other farmers, oh, actually, this can really work. But even better, how can we start to then think about interconnecting them, regulation and abstraction licenses put aside, for example. So it's definitely, the approach is definitely not a disregard or pushing smaller projects aside. They are fully integrated and seen as, the building blocks to kind of generate that extra relationship and buy-in and belief that further change can happen. I think what's critical, and you talked to it somewhat, is the terminology. So you talked there around environmental destination. Naturally, environmental destination might not land for farmers. Farmers right now care about business and money and being able to survive. Like, I'm from a farming family myself, so I get it. I'm in a different context. I'm down in Devon, different set of problems, but different terminologies work for different people. So I think that's part of what, as the Transition Lab in the earlier phases, really that visioning exercise. And some did feel that, oh, we're just repeating this vision that we've I thought I'd agreed on anyway. But we found that as a really helpful exercise really early on to anchor over 250 people in actually what are we starting to see as that vision, because it's that then when you get these areas of potential conflict later, you're always anchoring back to how it helps the vision that they've agreed on and co-created together. So yeah, that was just a couple of my reflections. I don't know whether Vicky or Phil, you've got anything to add there from Melvin's thoughts. Thank you for sharing all of them, Melvin.
I think what you said there, Melvin, about farmers needing a great case study, something that's worked in another context, as a great example for them to build on in their own context, is something that I heard from a stakeholder in a different project, but not too far geographically from the Fens. So I think that definitely resonates. And I think part of our exploration around possible interventions that could lead to landscape scale change in the theme I've been leading always hit that barrier around how could this unlock something. And I think that's why we settled on the water markets. It's kind of agnostic, but it allows you to look at individual circumstance, place-based issues, a particular place, a particular cluster, find out what works, and then take the learning from that and spin it off and then apply that somewhere else and learn the new lessons in that case. So I definitely agree with you. It will be a slow process, and I think you can see the fact that these partnerships have been working so hard in the Fens landscapes for the last 20 or 30 years. They've achieved a lot. They're really well connected, but there's still a long way to go, isn't there? So I think we're supporting that change, but it will take time.
Yes, I think that I've seen changes over the last 10 years or so with the IDBs. I mean, central to the Fens is the IDB, which has the ability to move water around from one part of the fen to the other, as they would normally be wanting to empty it into the North Sea. And I know that the IDB engineers, who well understand the systems there, are tuned into farming and making water available for farmers, even though it's not in their remit at the moment. Their remit is drainage, basically, and to avoid flooding, and they have a statutory duty for that. They have no statutory duty for water management in a resource perspective for farms. But I know they're wanting to change, and it's these sort of things that gradually grab hold of people. And when you talk to the IDB engineers, they're not just drains, let's get it out, to the North Sea. A lot of them do talk about this, and let's kind of keep some back, for farming and so on. So it is getting there, but I think it's just recognizing that it is a slow process, but anything that can speed that process up would be valuable. Mm-hmm.
There's definitely a slow process, Melvin. I've just seen the 2 questions around finance in the chat, which I can see from Faris and Fiona. One is, how far is the research into finding the ideal finance for future benefit to last for long term? I think that's an interesting question in terms of the idea that there is ideal finance for future benefit. I think the financial system as it is not set up currently to really think in long terms. the especially like the shareholder structure that we currently have for a lot of companies, it being publicly listed, that is a very short-term thinking that goes into that. And similarly with government, there's a lot of short-term thinking that happens. So for long term, I think this is still like a really difficult question in terms of how can money support long-term outcomes and not just be prioritized for short-term quick fixes. That's something that sits really deep in the system and in our financial system, as well as like how our government is set up and what our government priorities are. So I don't have an answer for you, Faris. And just more questions again. And then Fiona, each place and project will be different in terms of stakeholders and visions. Where do you see the initial funding for engagement and relationship building coming from? Yeah, it's a really, really good question, because I think a lot of the issues that we see with our stakeholders is that they don't have very much development finance. So it's great once the project is there and they know what it looks like, and they can have, they know where how the funding could work, even if they don't necessarily have funding, then people might be interested. What's really hard is to get to a place where you are in a position to be able to do that. And the development funding it's really tough to get that, because it's so speculative and it's high risk, and there's a real chance that this thing just won't work. And I think we see ourselves, North Star Transition, as being part of that, like helping people get to that, building those relationships, doing that initial engagement to help people get to a place where they can then potentially see how funding could come in. But there definitely needs to be more funding made available for that, like from whether that's public funding, grant funding. And I think a lot of philanthropy could actually help with that, and is actually not as good at they're very good at funding. Philanthropy is very good at funding specific projects for like maybe 2, 3, 4 years, but they're not as good at just doing like core funding or helping people just to build relationships to see what happens, and giving that flexibility. So we are, in conversations with different philanthropists and like foundations to see like how they could change how philanthropy works. Because there are so many gaps that we are seeing in terms of like developing these things from the ground up, and that's just not a place where private finance would get involved. And I think also there's a huge role for public funding here, government funding, in actually being that support, for like to ensure that like community building happens, relationships get built, get maintained, and we're seeing that, like for example in farm clusters, like pulling those together and enabling farmers to be in a small, like 6 to 7 or 10 farmers working together, can be really effective to enable change and to enable closer collaboration. But the funding for that facilitation isn't there. And there's some subsidy that's being made available for that, but it's piecemeal and not for a very long term. So yeah, there's lots of thinking going into that, Fiona. And again, no specific answers, just more thoughts and some more questions. So apologies for that.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank you for the questions. We are an organisation that loves questions, loves starting and answering a question with more questions, as you've probably learned throughout this last 45 minutes. I was going to wrap up just with sharing a takeaway, a lesson, something you might tell a colleague from today. We love that, given, as I was saying at the beginning, we don't usually do webinars because it's not our preferred format of engaging with an audience. So if you can just share in the last minute anything along those lines that will help us kind of understand what you've taken away and build that into future engagements, that would be super helpful, please, and thank you. And with that time as well, just wanted to thank you all for the energy and the attention that you've placed on the three of us today, and opening up your minds to the approach we're taking in the Fens, the great work of Anglian Water and all the other stakeholders working in the Fens. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the bank holiday if you're enjoying some downtime, or the half term. And if not, have a great afternoon and lunch at work. Thank you so much.